Hello and welcome to another episode of the ArenaCraft podcast, a show dedicated exclusively to Magic the Gathering Arena. My name is Arjuna, I'm one of your hosts. I'm joined today by not one, but two other hosts as we explore another guest feature on this show. So, of course, Covertgoblue, regular partner in crime, is present on the podcast. How are you doing, CGB?
Hey, I am super excited to go on and on about all the amazingness of the new constructed format. Oh, wait, hold on. That's not what this says. This says we have a limited mastermind in our midst.
We do indeed, and so I'm excited to welcome a special guest to the show, someone whose content I've been following for a long time. I'm sure if you A, play Arena, and B, like Limited, you probably are already familiar with this particular character. He is the founder and master educator at Arena's elite limited dueling academy. He's also just consistently a low-numbered mythic gamer and streamer, and I would say like a real free thinker in the world of draft. I think that's part of your trademark. So anyway, without further ado, here is Deathsie joining us from Korea. How are you doing, Deathsie?
Hey, thanks guys for having me. I am doing fantastic. It's about 8 a.m. here. I like your introduction for me that I'm a free thinker. I think that most people would probably consider me more along the lines of a sociopath, probably like a magic sociopath. Maybe more so than a free thinker.
I think that the Venn diagrams often overlap with those two concepts. I would also think that your opponents on Arena might think of you as a sociopath. I don't know, man. If there's one thing that I feel like stands out from your limited play, you're frequently killing people on turn 20 at like 2 life. You know what I mean?
That's true.
This is just like how Deathsie games go so often, which makes for really exciting content. So there's a lot that we could dive into here today. I think it's going to be a little bit difficult to keep it to a focused hour of discussion. But basically, I'm going to kick off with just like some general life questions for you. And then we'll dive a little bit more into the Zendikar Rising limited format, which I've been having a lot of fun with, and I feel like you've been enjoying it a lot too. And Covertgoblue can periodically throw paper airplanes at us or whatever.
Hi.
While having this discussion.
That's what I'm here for, yeah.
So, okay, Deathsie, general life questions first of all. So, you've been playing Magic for a long time, yeah?
Yeah, I've been playing probably around Innistrad. So I know for a lot of the Magic players, cute Innistrad. I was there back when Magic the Gathering was printed on freaking clay tablets or something like that. So it's been a long time, but it hasn't been that long, I suppose. But maybe about somewhere like 8 to 10 years with some gaps in between there.
And when did you figure out that Limited was your true calling in Magic?
It was almost initially when I first started playing. So I started playing, and my brothers and their friends had just like a bunch of like junk commons and uncommons lying around. And my very first interaction with Magic was like staying up for 50 hours straight, just building decks. I was like, at first, I was like, this nerdy card game. I don't want to look at this card game. This is like the game that the smelly kids played in the library back in school, And my brothers and their friend introduced me to it, and immediately I was hooked. And for 50 hours straight, I was just building random decks.
The deck building really stood out to you as an exciting part of it. I can see why that translates over to Limited pretty well.
I mean, I would say that like I was addicted to Magic, and I obviously at that point I didn't know really what formats existed in Magic. I didn't really know how people played Magic, how people interacted with it, but I was drawn immediately to kind of like the simplicity yet complexity of the game. Soon after that, I started going to like local game shops and stuff like that. And I personally think that limited is the easiest way for anyone to get into Magic. You don't have to have any cards. You just sit down at a table. Once you learn how to draft, you can build your deck, and then you can just play with other people. You just don't need anything at all. So that's kind of how I started. Back in those days, like back in my day, if you were a limited player, you were also a constructed player. Like, for the vast majority of people cannot just play draft all the time like you can now on either Magic Online or Magic Arena. So, of course, I played a lot of constructed. As you can imagine, I played decks that like were just either 5-color decks or just like random junky but expensive decks with all like, planeswalkers and mythic rares and stuff like that. So the more I played constructed, the more I realized that I was just there for the limited, honestly. Like, the constructed was just the aftermath for me.
That's an interesting way of looking at it. After playing Magic myself for a lot of my life, I have discovered that one of the things that I like the most about limited is that I feel like from start to finish, it's a puzzle. It's like from the moment you start sitting down, picking cards, you're already figuring something out. So, and then when you get to the gameplay, you're figuring out how to make this pile of crappy cards you've thrown together into a deck that can actually manage to have some kind of a cogent game plan. To me, it seems like you really enjoy the puzzle of it from start to finish. Would you say that that's correct?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. To me, drafting has this almost like battle royale or this sort of Hunger Games feeling to it, where everyone comes in with nothing but like a backpack and like maybe a hunting knife or something like that, and it's like last man or woman is standing wins. And that's all you came in with. Like, everyone's sitting at the table with the same exact stipulations, right? The same exact $15 for your draft packs instead of maybe anywhere from like $200 to like $500 for your constructed deck. And that's all you've got. Just whatever's on your back and your brain. So I think that there's something kind of romantic about it that everyone starts from that initial point and you see who's still standing at the end.
So one of the things I've noticed about your play in particular is that I feel like no cards are off the table for you, which I think really feeds into that kind of battle royale approach. Like, I think most people, when they go into limited, they're like building a tier list. They quickly come up with like 30% of the set, which is just unplayable to them.
Sure.
I never pick that card. I forget that card even exists. Occasionally my opponents resolve it against me and I'm like, oh, that's cute. But one thing I've noticed about you is I feel like you're like, is this a 3 Cliffhaven kite sail deck? Maybe, maybe. Sure. Like, what? Sure. Like, let's not discount that possibility. So that's one of the things I wanted to ask you about, just from a broad level perspective. How do you go about thinking about that? How do you get from this card's really crummy most of the time to, wow, this is a cool card, I'm going to throw this in my deck?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So, kind of going back to the sort of survival analogy, is that if you think about the way that maybe like MacGyver thinks, right? Like, MacGyver isn't locked in a room and he doesn't go like, okay, well, ropes are good, knives are good, vases suck. And I don't know, like, he doesn't have the ego, like he doesn't judge the objects in the room, the things that he has at his disposal, as something that's good or bad. He thinks about how to use it, right? He's like, okay, well, what does this do? What can I do with this? Realistically, how do these two things combine together? Whereas maybe like you're starting with, I don't know, like maybe you're starting with like a water bottle and like a towel. and then maybe you can combine these two things to create like, I don't know, some sort of contraption, whereas the two initial items really didn't do anything at all. So to me, that's kind of the way that I approach Magic and drafting in general, is that you kind of have to give up that ego, where it's like, I know that Magic players want to think that cards are good and cards are bad, when realistically, like, what you're trying to do is to find when a card is good and when a card is bad, right? So trying to figure out that puzzle and not necessarily be too caught up on being right or wrong about a card evaluation.
I really love that. It kind of reminds me of your approach to deck building CGB, right? Because, I mean, a lot of what you do is just going through the whole card pool every day and trying to figure out what's another interesting archetype to explore in Constructed. Like, would you say that's how you approach it?
I think so. And I understand how a lot of people get to the place that they do on card verdicts, because we need shortcuts, because there's so much going on and there's so much thinking to do in just about every aspect of Magic, that creating shortcuts of which cards are good and which cards are bad mean that we don't have to think as much. And it is a very thought intensive game. But the trick is to always be willing to retrace your steps. Because if I got obsessed with which cards were great for the decks that I build for each different day, they'd all look the same. Whereas building around different cards takes you in different paths. And I don't know how, as a content creator, one of the things that I'm constantly faced with is comments that it feels like one by one people are trying to direct me to so-and-so, like a deck that's already good, a deck list that's already good, that already exists, right? Like I start out brewing like black-white clerics, and they're trying to turn it into red-black mid-range one card at a time. Like that's what Twitch chat does. And you almost have to you have to stay on target. You have to Luke Skywalker this thing, and you have to be like, no, we think that this is the thesis, that this card is good in this situation. This is why I think we can create these circumstances. So we're going to focus on this interaction, not this, like, not the other place that everybody is used to going. If that makes sense.
What I love about this approach to Magic, and I think one of the reasons I'm excited to talk about this, as opposed to some of the more specific things we could get into right now, is that I think the former approach that you were talking about, CGB, let's turn this into a known good deck, that's the approach to like winning my next game of Magic. I think there's a lot of Magic players who are like, I hate losing, I want to win my next 10 games of Magic and feel good about myself. And I think that's something that you guys are both getting at here, is that when you open your mind to the possibility of playing cards you're not used to playing, you're just working on getting better at Magic. You're working on your base skill set, and you're leveling up some of your kind of unglamorous numbers. It's like everyone wants to get their warrior's strength up to 99 or whatever, but you're like working on your charisma, you're working on your ingenuity, you're working on all these different things to make you a more rounded...
I need a lot of work on that charisma. Every day I'm doing those charisma push-ups, baby.
Oh, man.
On that topic, just before we get into it, Deathsie, you majored in the social sciences, is that right? Remind us what it was that you studied in school.
So for both my undergraduate and my master's degree at the London School of Economics, I mastered in sociology. Yeah, so sociology is a lot about the way that we think. Nothing's really set in stone, and it's all about the perspective of how we see reality, almost, in terms of societal interactions, and the way that almost like common sense is perceived.
I feel like you bring a lot of that perspective to your playing Magic. Would you say that is the case?
I'm not sure which way it is. If my sociological background influences my Magic background, or maybe I've just been kind of that kind of person who just wants to see some sort of greater truth. But that is a very common theme for me in almost everything I do. I just have this weird feeling that I just don't want to live a lie, essentially. I just want to get as close to the truth as possible, even if it kills me. So it's like, one of those curiosity kill the cat moments. People ask me all the time if I had an opportunity to open Pandora's box, would I do it? Absolutely. Absolutely. Like, I need to open it right now. Figure out what happens after.
I love it. And I think that's one of the reasons your content is so compelling, right? Is that you're like trying weird things and being super unapologetic about it.
Oh, yeah.
For any of you who aren't currently watching Deathsie, I would just go check him out, even if you're not that excited about Limited. It's just a singular experience. Nowhere else in Magic are you going to see someone running a 40-card deck with 5 Riptide turtles in it and just crushing people. So
I'd also like to stress that this isn't outside of the competitive setting. You are a very competitive person, and you consistently rank extremely well while experimenting, which I think is... I mean, even if you ask professional Magic players, there are people who will tell you that you just can't do that, which, like, how is it? And Arjuna says you're unapologetic. I mean, do you ever, is the rank is probably the side effect, right? Like it's kind of it's not really the objective. Is that true?
Yeah, I think that is very much true. Oftentimes my rank, to be honest, like, sometimes I'll be messing around and I'll just randomly be in like top 10 or top 5 mythic or something in limited, which obviously isn't always the case, but sometimes that is the case. And the main thing for me about getting high ranks is just having a clickbait title. Honestly, that's it.
Yes.
I don't really care that much about the rank, but
you said it.
Yeah, no, completely. And that's the thing, is that I don't care about my rank as much as the viewers care about my rank, which kind of sucks. It's kind of a double-edged sword because I'll get people in, but at the same time, like, whenever I start losing, then like my chat is nothing but, oh, what happened to your rank? What happened to your rank? What do you think happened to my rank? The number went up. I just lost. That's it.
I lost games of Magic. Oh my God.
I think it certainly is interesting because it's important to get like the weird stuff out early and just to know exactly how bad a bad card is, or to know when to use this card that people seemingly think is unplayable, right? So in Zendikar Rising, there's like this card called Concerted Defense.
yeah, it's like the Spell Pierce kind of card.
It's like a bad Spell Pierce negate kind of card. Yeah, and basically it's like it counters non-creature spell for a 1+ each party member you have for 1 blue mana. It's a card that's kind of questionable because it's printed in a same set that also has negate. But at the same time, I found it actually quite potent in these like blue-white builds. Just as long as you have varying party members in the deck, is that in this format, people are just tapping out. You know, like you're tapping out for exact mana. This format is very much about like, on 6 mana, we're gonna cast our kicker card. You know, like it's gonna be either like a Cunning Geyser Mage, or it's gonna be or it's gonna be like a Field Research or something. And if you can counter one of those like powerful non-creature spells, then you're in a pretty good spot. But it's obviously not a good card. But you need to recognize like when this is an effect that your deck is potentially interested in. So you need to get that kind of testing out and not really care much about losing in the beginning. To me, losing is essentially an investment for the future. So you lose and you figure things out. And a lot of my viewers, you know, like, you're welcome. I'm losing so that you have information, you know? So don't complain to me that I'm losing. They're like, all right, well, I know so much now from all the science that Deathsie said. And honestly, I think that that's just very, very much humanity, where it's like we just really take for granted the sort of research and the sort of difficulties that it's taken to reach a certain point. And now we're like, oh yeah, we have this medicine, we have ibuprofen, and just like all this random stuff, and we just never really give it any thought.
It's almost like they don't see the process, right? Like I do X, Y, Z, or I do what the checklist says, and I should be victorious.
Yeah, exactly.
Good cards, just play only good cards, just play a certain way, and
I
the
feel
process is messy.
Exactly, and it's not only that they don't see the process. I feel like a lot of people don't care about the process, and they just care about the victory symbol. Like the victory symbol. And I know it is expensive, so I can kind of get it from that perspective. That if you win, you get to play more. And maybe that's their relationship with Magic. But at the same time, for me, it's the process. That is almost exclusively what I care about Magic. A lot of times, like I'll draft a deck and I'll conceptualize about it. And in all honesty, I feel like playing out the games kind of detracts from that. It's like, I have this beautiful concept here. And I'm like visualizing how all these games are going to play out on the play or in the draw. And then actually playing my games is the worst part about that, because you don't always get the sort of actualization of it.
Yeah, man. I feel that so much. I almost have when I like really love a deck I've built, I actually have this anxiety to play it, because I know if like the first 2 or 3 games are me getting mana screwed or something like that, chat's going to start erupting and you need to change this and you should do that. And this deck is garbage. And oh man, I feel that so much, dude.
Dude, that's painful, man. Oh man. That's why like these days, I actually tell my viewers just straight up that my favorite thing in Magic is actually talking about Magic. Mm-hmm. Playing is probably on the lower end of my list.
Yeah. Likewise.
Because it's like the good Magic is like quite good, but the bad Magic is like quite bad. I feel so. It's this very, very strange experience where it's you don't always get to live the sort of dream that you're imagining.
And I think that one of the things that you're getting at here, Deathsie, kind of highlights some of the specific challenges in Zendikar Rising draft as well. So like, for example, you were talking about looking at a deck, how it plays on the draw versus how it plays on the play. And from watching your content, I've come to think that there are some cards in this format that you're a lot lower on than you otherwise would be, simply because they just don't play well on the draw. Would you say that's correct?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about that a little. The card that comes to my mind as a best example of this, kind of like the marquee plays terribly on the draw card, would be a card like a Coom Hellhound.
Okay.
A card that's doing literally nothing for you if you're blocking.
Yep.
I'd be interested to hear you just talk about that a little bit more. What are some of the cards that, or even whole archetypes, that you're lower on in this format simply because they don't play well on the draw?
Yeah, so for me, a lot of drafting, and probably Magic in general, is trying to risk assess. So you're trying to manage that degree of risk that you're taking by the cards you play. So the thing is that, a lot of times we look at the ceiling of a card. How good can this card be at its best state? And then sometimes we'll look at the floor of a card where it's like, okay, when this card's bad, at least it's like, maybe at least it's a 3-mana 3/3. Whenever we're talking about Magic cards in this sense, is that we're really just trying to figure out how good is this card. So, for example, a card like Crushing Canopy, right? So Crushing Canopy can kill for 2 colors and a green. You can kill a flyer, artifact, or enchantment at instant speed. The ceiling of this card is, killing their awesome flyer. There's like there's a lot of like good rare flyers in the format that you'll be super happy to Crushing Canopy, or maybe you'll hit like Elusive Drakes or something along those lines. Now, what's the floor of that card? Is that it's a dead card in your hand and it doesn't hit absolutely anything. So you always need to take these risks into account when you're picking cards, when you're building your deck. Zendikar Rising has a lot of inherent cards that have a high ceiling and a really, really bad low end. Where, as you said, like a lot of times these cards are not doing anything when you're on the draw. So most of these landfall cards actually, especially the ones with like low toughness, are actually not that good in this format if you're not going first. I actually try to stay away from these archetypes for the most part, because best one is an experience on Magic Arena that is not only already punishing, because being on the draw in Magic is already punishing, but there's the hand smoother as well, which essentially amplifies the aggressiveness of being on the play. So realistically, another way you can look at that is that being on the draw is even more bad in best of one. So you really have to be careful in how you build these decks. Best of three is kind of similar. Maybe sometimes you can have some Akum Hellhounds in the sideboard and like Brushfire Elemental, Skyclave Geopede in the sideboard, and then actually bring it in when you're on the play. I think that's a successful strategy as well. But for the most part, you really have to just be careful. So this sort of like red-green landfall deck is probably the worst Gruul deck, in my opinion, in the format. But it is potent when you're on the play.
Which I just want to stop and take note of that, because that is the marquee theme for that color in the set, right? It's like that, that color combination has been designed to do that thing. And so I just think that it's interesting, and I would agree with you here. It's like my most successful Gruul decks in this format have been just kind of a lot more mid-rangey, or flexed some kind of weird synergies like wizards randomly or something else that aren't really supposed to be supported in that format. Or like I've seen you play, you're kind of like the person who coined Gruul control in Zendikar Rising Limited. So let's go into some specifics about that. Like let's say you're building a Gruul deck, what are some of the cards or archetypes that are kind of surprising that people might not initially think about, which end up going really well in that?
So this was kind of a tangent into dual face cards as well. In my opinion, the best dual face cards are actually in green and in red. And partially because the cards that actually allow you to pick up lands in these colors. So in red, you have Pyroclastic Helion. In green, you have Stomper. I don't remember Stomper's first name.
Kazandu Stomper.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, okay, so Kazandu Stomper. I think that both of these cards are also just good Magic cards in your deck already, but then they also pick up these game-winning dual face cards that you played as a land earlier, and then now it's a game-winning spell. That's generally the best way to play Gruul in this format, in my opinion.
It is a land synergy deck. It's just not necessarily a landfall synergy deck.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And in order to get to that point where you can pick up the lands and stuff like that, you really don't want to have these landfall creatures that are only attacking, right? So you want to be looking more for creatures that can just trade off well. One of the cards that I really like is Jiraga Visionary. 4 mana, 3/2, green elf wizard, and when you play her, she draws a card. So a really potent card in just being able to get to that late game while trading off resources earlier on. A much better blocker, a card that you're much happier to block with than, say, one of your aggressive creatures that simply go 1-for-1.
Yeah. One of the kind of maybe underexplored or misunderstood things about cards like this, or I think Into the Royal is another good example, is that these are cards that basically set you up to keep hitting your land drops. So I think that that's one of the things that people will often miss when they look at a card like this. They'll look at a 3/2 for 4 that draws a card, and they'll think, well, it's somewhat of an unimpressive body, but it does get me some card advantage. For me, when I'm looking at that card, 50% of that card is like, I play this on turn 4 so that I can play my land drop on turn 5. And I think that that really enables a lot of what these like blue-green and red-green decks are trying to do, just kind of like you were saying, is to put out more lands than your opponent and cast these big stompy creatures, and also, you know, have some extra lands to work with so that you can pick up your DFCs and actually try to cast them. You know, being able to pick up your Act of Treason double-faced land and then actually be able to cast it on the following turn is like a really potent thing. Or being able to cast your Akum Warrior, which I think is one of the better DFCs in the format. I see those wheeling way too often, man. So I'd like to talk about red, actually, because I know that you've been a huge champion of red in this format. I think that you've said on stream that red is your favorite color in the Zendikar Rising limited format. Would you say that that's true?
Yes, I would say that that's true. Red is a color that I would choose to be in every time if I could.
So take us through that. What are the reasons that you're excited to play red in the format?
So I think red is actually very good at both attacking and blocking. It's good at being offensive and defensive. Royal Eruption probably being the best common in the format. You know, kind of like a bad lightning strike with kicker. But in this format, it really overperforms. And once again, Pyroclastic Helion, one of the cards that really stand out to me, just being able to pick up your Casual's Fury or being able to pick your Songmad Treachery, or even like a Spikefield Hazard a lot of times even has late game implications. So red has been a really, really sweet color for me. There's a lot of the cards that I really, really like. Even like a Fissure Wizard, for example, is a card that helps smooth out your draws. Sometimes if you're in red-black, you have some sweet combos with reanimation stuff. But yeah, for the most part, I really like how red pairs with all of the other colors in the format. Whereas like some of the other colors are very strong as well, but the color combinations are a little bit more awkward. You just won't always be able to get a nice deck when the two colors are open, because you might, just because the cards don't work as well together, I suppose.
Yeah, I think I would agree with you. There's also just some funny things about red in this format that I think are they're not typical of red in most sets. So for example, you have a surprising number of high toughness creatures in red. So like the Hellion being a good example. There's the 2-drop 1/3 that you can pump. You've also got the 2/3 warrior that becomes a 4/3 at 3 mana. And also even just like the Spitfire Legak with 4 toughness. So I think that that's something that's a little bit, again, like people aren't thinking about that as much, but you've got these surprisingly chonky red creatures that, as you said, do a pretty good job of blocking. There's also just some really nice, sweet little synergies, like you'll pick up 1 or 2 Cinderclasms in your draft, which is another card I think is kind of criminally underdrafted. And you'll have these situations where you're looking down at your board and you're like, I have a 1/3, I have a 2/3, I have a 3/4. And my opponent playing, you know, Orzhov has like a bunch of 2/1s and 2/2s and random stuff. Or like, you know, my blue opponent has a bunch of Drakes and 3/2 wizards and stuff like that. And you can just cast this like one-sided instant speed board wipe for 3 mana. So I think that there are some subtleties like that in the red color which aren't immediately apparent, but which when you start to play the games, you realize like, wow, these cards just play really, really nicely together.
And overall, the colors of this format actually do feel quite balanced. For me, balance is not the be-all, end-all. I don't think that formats actually necessarily have to be balanced. But for this format, the colors are relatively balanced. I think that white is a little bit on the weak side. But for the most part, all of the color combinations, they have their appeal. It makes it pretty interesting because for this format, every single color combination actually can do so many different things. So for me, Zendikar Rising has actually been the most complex drafting format for a long time. I think that the last time I felt that a draft format was this complex was actually War of the Spark. And this one might even be more complex than that. Just because you have so many different lanes, you have to figure out if you're a tribal deck. You need to figure out if you're a party deck. Maybe you're like 50% tribal Maybe you're like a wizard deck, but then you have like other party creatures in there slotted in and some party payoffs and synergies. Sometimes you're just a deck of unemployed creatures that just have no job at all. And they're just like all random beasts and bats and snakes and stuff like that, which is generally like what the black-green archetype is. So you just have so many different lanes, and you need to figure out if your deck wants like these dual face cards, and you need to find ways to pick them up. And honestly, that's kind of the main appeal for me for the format, is that the drafting experience is so robust. I will say that as time goes on, the actual playing part of it, I think that basically at this point now, about a month and a half in, I think. It has been a month and a half already since Zendikar has come out.
It's almost a month for Arena release.
Oh, really?
It does feel like forever, though.
If we lived a lifetime of Omnath between then and that.
Yeah, so a month into the format, I feel like people are now understanding how many lands to run, roughly. Understanding when to play like a dual face card over a land, understanding the sort of synergistic approach to the format and building a coherent deck, which honestly I think that people took a long time to figure out because of the complexity of the draft format. So to me, Zendikar Rising now is actually an incredibly superior drafting format, but in terms of the play, it has diminished somewhat for me.
That's really interesting. It's a cool distinction to make. And I do think that a lot of your most diehard drafters will tell you that the most exciting part of draft is actually the drafting portion, right? You have these people like Ben Stark who want to do like a drafting pro tour where everyone just drafts and then a panel of judges examines their deck afterwards and decides who wins. And then they just go on to the next draft.
Oh, yeah.
The future of Limited.
Oh, yeah. Future of Magic, I hope.
I mean, I don't know if it's a derail, but I was hoping with Deathsie here that we would have a minute to talk about competitive Magic and drafting. Like, sure. Do you think that there's a way to make Limited a compelling thing for like whatever their vision is of esports? Because it's pretty much since Worlds, which had a drafting portion, there hasn't been Limited involved in competitive Magic at all since then. And that seems to be what they want to stick to. And that definitely wasn't the way it was for many years. Do you think we can get it back?
Yeah, so I think that one of the main reasons that Magic Arena is so constructed, aka standard focused, is that it's very easy for a viewer to come in and be like, oh, this is a vampire deck, right? This deck is trying to play black-white vampires and trying to put counters and stuff and attack your opponent to death. Okay, and then that person can then go over to Magic Arena or whatever and then basically start constructing that same deck. There's a very easy like A, B, C kind of roadmap to how to get into the format, how to start playing Magic. Now, the thing about Limited, and this has been traditionally the main reason why I think that Limited has been kind of confusing, maybe for a newer player, is that you start watching people play and like they're like picking cards and stuff like that, and you don't know what any of the cards do. And then they build a deck that you don't really know like what's in their deck. This is kind of how it used to be, where it's like it was really hard to put up information about people's deck because people would register the decks in paper, and then you would have to have like an actual intern or like employee, typing in the cards, putting up the cards image by image. And for me, a lot of that is very clunky. So having these limited tournaments and stuff, you couldn't really provide all of the information that you would wish to provide to the viewers so that they understand kind of what's going on in addition to the process, like in addition to kind of explaining what drafting is. So I think that for me, the main key to this will be Magic Arena, which honestly, I'm kind of terrified after saying that. But you really want a simple way to basically export the deck list, right? So like you do your draft on Magic Arena, you export that draft list, the deck list, and you can even go back and have a replay of the draft at that table. And I think that you really need to find ways to facilitate that sort of drafting experience. And I think that some sort of online platform will be able to do that well. You know, back in the day, we used to have a camera over someone's shoulder, right? Like while they're drafting, and it's like, okay, well, this is like a terrible viewing experience. This is actually just the worst thing ever.
I called it the parrot cam.
The parrot cam, yeah.
Yeah.
And so in addition to some of those informational issues, you know, trying to get information to the viewers, I think that you just really need to sell limited as a competitive format. So what I would do, for example, is I would create, you know, kind of what we're talking about before, is that, well, I would create some sort of marketing perspective where it's like, okay, well, limited is you just get in there with 3 booster packs and it's like a battle royale. I think that you can create like really, really cool visuals for that and explain very simply to viewers in like 20 seconds exactly what a booster draft is. And from that point on, it's like, oh, well, everybody understands what drafting is. Yep. It's not like, hey, what's draft? Because I personally get a lot of viewers, and I'm sure that you do too, CGB, that they come in and they're like, what's a draft? In my opinion, Wizards hasn't even done a great job at explaining what a draft is. So that's kind of my perspective.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot that they, I think, could do to get people into the process. But Arena does hold some sweet keys to replayability. I don't know why there wasn't, there was an event, right, where you could take the standard decks from Worlds and play them, right? Why isn't there an event to recreate a seat at Worlds at the draft table?
True.
Like you could play really cool a Worlds draft. I could play it from Paulo Vito Damadrosa's seat. How freaking cool would that be? Or you could just do the decks. You could just build the decks and play them against the other decks from it. But I think the drafting part sounds way more appealing. And that's as somebody who doesn't even enjoy the limited. So like I would try that.
Dude, imagine being in Taralf's Zeverin's seat and not taking the Dream Troller in that Worlds draft.
Ooh.
That's an experience I would pay money to be in his seat, you know what I mean?
So one of the things, and this is maybe a little bit overcritical for the scope of the podcast, but a big part of me always feels like the perspective from Magic the Gathering is that Magic is just too big to fail, where it's like, oh yeah, well, we're Magic. We don't need to do like actual marketing or anything. You know, like we just make the stuff and people are going to buy it. That's it. You know, like Magic Arena, it's going to be, all right, we're going to introduce the formats. No one's going to know about the formats, but they're going to play it, you know, like they're going to find it somehow. They're getting a little bit better at that, I think, where it's like now they actually are like sending out emails and like, hey, there's this new, you know, this format's back or something like that. But before, the only time that people would ever know that a format is actually back on Magic Arena to draft is they would find it through my stream. You know, they'd be like, oh, I didn't even know this format was back and I play Magic Arena every day. I'm playing this other format right now. And a lot of times it's like tucked away. It's tucked away either in like the toggle tab or it's tucked away in like the play button on the side.
Yeah. Yep. The play blade, man. That I was going to say, if you're about to say that they found it through the play blade, I'm going to be like, no, they didn't. Nobody. So the way that you said on stream was perfect because I was just looking at Twitter and Voxy said I'm playing, I think it was Throne of Eldraine draft. And
Theros, I think.
Theros draft. And Alias replies, oh, I didn't even know that was live. I'm going live right now.
Yeah, it's so funny, right? Because the thing is like we're full-time content creators.
Yep.
And the thing is that it's got to tell you something when even we don't know what's going on. It's like I was talking to Raphael Levy yesterday, and I was like, yeah, all 32 players in the MPL, right? And then Raph goes, oh yeah, I think there's like 28 or 24 now. See, I don't remember. I don't even know how many
24.
players in the 24. Okay. I don't know what the MPL is. I don't know anything about the MPL. I don't know how many players are in there. I know Raf's in there. I don't know who else is in there. Anyways.
I probably know too much about it because I covered it for Tempo Storm for a year, for its inaugural year. But that's the only reason I know.
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying is like Wizards just feels like they're too big to fail, right? It's like nobody knows what anything is, when anything's happening, and at the same time, Wizards is still like, oh, okay, well, their loss, they should know. They're gonna figure it out. Maybe they can find it after digging through our website for like 2 or 3 hours or something. I don't know.
Yeah, trust me, you're not being too critical for the scope of the podcast. That's we kind of come together and bring the thunder when necessary. And
okay,
I agree completely that Wizards, I think, has stopped selling. Well, I don't even know if they know what it is they sell. I think that their expertise right now is getting money out of people who already know their game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and eventually that doesn't last forever. So that at some point, and I hope it's in the works, I'm sure that they're not oblivious to this. They have smart people there, but they need to figure out how to sell Magic to people who don't know everything about the last 20 years of Magic.
True. Yeah.
Yeah, especially because games like Legends of Runeterra are really bringing it. They're like making a client that's easy to get into, that performs well, that gives you a lot of rewards, that's like very newbie friendly. Yeah. So, and I mean, Hearthstone's been doing a really good job of it for years as well. So yeah, I totally agree. If Magic wants to compete in the long run, it's going to have to get so much better about that. I mean, can you imagine? You've never heard of Magic before. You're like, you enjoy tabletop gaming, you've played some Settlers of Catan or whatever, and you download the Magic Arena client and you play through that, frankly, kind of laughable intro sequence. And then like you play your first game on the ladder and you just get frickin' demolished. Someone goes off with their Omnath or whatever. I mean, honestly, I'd be like, I can't handle this game. I'm going back to Farmville or whatever it was that I was playing before. Like, I can't do it. I still feel that way sometimes. I go into Magic and I play a couple of games on the ladder and I'm just like, what is this game? I'm not going to play anymore today. So as a new player, I can't even imagine what that feeling must be like of just overwhelm, confusion, menu confusion, economy confusion, gameplay mechanics confusion. It's just such a lot.
And then after all of that, after that loss, the game client will ask you, did you have fun? Smiley face, sad face.
Smiley face. Yeah. Honestly, I think that's why streaming and content creation is probably more essential than it ever was, because like you are the gateway for many people to making heads or tails out of this insane world that has been built for everybody. So it's more important than ever. And it's even hard for us to even know what's going on. I know more about how to get into competitive Shadowverse than I do about Magic the Gathering. And I probably play like 2 hours of Shadowverse a month and I don't know how many hours of Magic. It's my daily waking and going to bed thoughts are Magic. And I still don't know how I would go about getting to the MPL. Like,
oh my goodness. Yeah.
Yeah. Crazy.
Indeed. It's an interesting place that we find ourselves. I mean, to be honest, one of the reasons, we're even having this conversation right now is that the Zendikar Rising draft has been kind of a saving grace for me, because otherwise it would have been very, very difficult for me to motivate to play Magic during this last month or so. So having said all of the things that we've said so far here, and I definitely agree with everything that's been said, I do think that these limited formats have been pretty deep and pretty compelling over the last couple of years, and I definitely want to give them some props for that, because it's really important to have other ways to play Magic. I did want to get back to the Zendikar Rising draft just a little bit more before we close up here, because I want for our listeners to be able to take away some concrete tips to crush the opposition and get ahead. One of the things I wanted to discuss with you a little bit more, Deathsie, was conceptually, because I think a lot of people can listen to Limited Resources or Lords of Limited or whatever and like get the breakdown on like Rakdos Party is a good archetype. Blue-red wizard is a good archetype. Blue-green kicker is a good archetype. So I think that's kind of the baseline level of the format, and I think that there are a lot of different resources people can go to get that kind of information. What I'm really excited to talk with you about, Deathsie, is just some of the broader conceptual ideas that I think people might be missing in a format like this. So
Sure.
One of the things I've heard you talk about a lot is how underwhelming a decent amount of the removal in this format has been to you, and how there's like a really deep kind of analysis that you're making on mana investment and tempo when you approach removal in this format. So because removal spells are often pack 1, pick 2 kind of cards, sometimes even first pickable cards, oftentimes the cards that people really look out for in the, in their picks to try to fill out their deck, I think it's a really important place to be thinking about value and power. So can you speak to us a little bit on the removal in the format and what your concept is of it right now?
Yeah, so most of the removal in the format is actually quite bad. The stat lines don't really line up that well, especially when you take rares into account as well. A lot of the good rares are going to have like 4 toughness, and they're going to be quite difficult for most colors to deal with outside of black. And so one of the great examples in this format is a lot of times people have played versus a Ruin Crab, right? Ruin Crab, 1 mana, 0/3, landfall, your opponent mills 3 cards. And it's incredibly frustrating because if you look at the vast majority of the removal, you have to spend like you either have to spend a premium removal on it, like premium cheap removal on it, or you have to spend like 5 mana to kill that. And it's incredibly awkward, honestly. So no matter if you spend 2 mana removal or 3 mana removal or 5 mana removal to kill the Ruin Crab, which is generally a must-kill threat, you're still going to be losing out on some front. So kind of a weird thing about the format. I do feel like certain cards, Ruin Crab and also the black-blue gold card, Soaring Thought Thief, they're just a little bit too well statted and do a little bit too much early on in this format. I'd be a little bit happier if they were like maybe rares or maybe like just delete Ruin Crab or something. Yeah, so anyways, like the removal's not good. I think that one of the main things that you want to try to do in this format, instead of going 1-for-1, just because in general 1-for-1ing is just not very good, is that you want to try to find ways to get card advantage on your opponent. So one of the main draws into red in terms of the uncommons for me is Thundering Spark Mage. So this is a 4 mana 2/2 that will enters the battlefield, deals damage equal to party. So the amount of party you have. So you can develop a creature while killing one of their creatures. Same thing in this format with like Drana Silencer. It's a 6 mana black 3/2 that does a similar thing.
I wanted to tangent on that card a little bit because I know it's like one of Deathsie's pet cards that a lot of other people think is basically unplayable. I think one of the reasons people are kind of down on it is that it doesn't compare favorably to Blight Breath Catoblepus, which is the last time we had an effect like that. The Catoblepus was consistently, nugging for like 4 or 5 or even more. Whereas I think that the Silencer is more often a 1 or a 2 kind of a hit. So can you talk with us briefly about like how highly do you take this card and how much setup do you do before you consider running it in your deck?
Yeah, so I think that this kind of goes back to our initial conversation on basically getting rid of that ego in Magic, where it's obviously the Drana Silencer is a worse version of the Blight Breath Catoblepus in Theros, but they are both different formats. And also, I would say that Drana Silencer is respectively better in Zendikar than Blight Breath was in Theros. So what I mean by that is that Theros was a format that stalled out like crazy. So you had incredible board stalls where oftentimes you play a Blight Breath Catoblepus and the board is still stalled and nothing changes. So in this format, however, is a lot more it's a lot more board centric and also like combat centric. So even like controlling decks are going to try to figure out when they can make attacks, when they and when they should block. So in this format, Drannith Silencer is actually a lot better because the thing is that the creatures on the board actually just matter more. Now, it's not a great card, but if you are a party deck, and especially if you have like Thwart the Grave, it gets a lot better. Things that you're looking for: Fissure Wizard, a card that helps you get up to 6 mana. You're looking for cards like Thwart the Grave or Blood Beckoning to actually like get repeated value off of these effects as well and try to keep that party type up. And in general, it should kind of be your top end. Again, not the most exciting card, but it's a card that's better than most people do give it credit for.
Yeah, and I appreciate those kind of takes because I think that that's exactly the kind of card where it's easy to just get blind to it, right? You draft enough and eventually you don't even see it anymore. Yep. You know, you're like, oh, that's just that 15th pick that automatically gets selected at the end of a pack for me, you know, because it's just not on your radar. And I totally agree that I think getting edges in limited formats, especially after month 1, cards like Drannith Silencer are like the linchpin of that. You don't get better at limited by realizing that a bomb rare is good.
Sure.
You know, you're just like, look, I pick that whenever it's in my colors. Sometimes I divert my color because I got a chance to pick it. That's about as good as you're going to get with those cards. They're just good. Play them and you win kind of a thing, right? Mm-hmm. But I think where you really get your edge in limited formats is saying, you know what, Drannith Silence is better than I thought it was, and I'm going to start taking it a little bit more highly, and I'm actually going to consider it a build around in my deck.
Sure.
Because then, you know, you're like ensuring that card number 23 is also a good card in your deck, right? So you're like, when I don't draw my life-linking rogue flyer, I still have game because all of the cards in my deck theoretically are able to do something for me.
Yeah, so a lot about drafting for me is just trying to draft the best deck possible for your seat and also building the best deck possible. So outside of that, honestly, everything else is out of your control. You can't really do much else outside of that, but play well, I guess. Essentially, that should be the goal. It's like, okay, well, how well can I draft my seat? How well can I build my deck? And then after that, it's a smooth sailing from there.
So let me ask you, what are some other cards like that? Maybe this is kind of a hard question to answer on the spot, but are there some other like random commons or uncommons that you think are underrated or that you feel like you have been having success with when other people haven't?
I feel like Negate in blue has actually been a pretty good role player, and it only really works if you have other things to do at instant speed. You can't be a tap out deck and then just have a random negate in there. It doesn't really work like that. But if you're a deck that can play instant speed, maybe you have some Living Tempest to flash in, maybe you have like Into the Royals, and you can also hold a negate at the same time. I think that it's actually quite good in this format. This format, the non-creature stuff in general is kind of big and clunky. So I actually kind of like negate and to some extent the concerted defense.
So one of the consistent themes that I'm hearing from you is that efficiency is really important in this format. I remember I was watching Andrea Mangucci streaming this limited format, and he said something that really stuck with me, which was he was talking about exquisite spellcraft. It's the 5 mana deal for. He was
synchronized spellcraft.
That's the one. And he was saying that he was like, you know, this card's just too expensive. I wouldn't run more than one of these in most of my decks in this format. And I totally agreed with him. And I've noticed that I've gotten in this spot a lot in this format where I'll have like, the 5 mana deal for and the 5 mana draw 3. You know, like I'll kind of have all these clunky, expensive cards in my hand. And I'm really struggling to feel like I have a good window to cast any of them.
Yep.
Sometimes you dealing 4 to a creature and taking your entire turn is just not good enough in this format. You know, sometimes like drawing 3 cards and having that be your whole turn, it's just not good enough. So it's really interesting how I think you would probably agree with me on this, that the Costly Plunder or something.
It's like Skyclave Plunder or something like
Plunder,
that.
yeah, exactly. Like has gone down in my estimation, whereas the Kicker Divination has gone up in my estimation.
Yep.
So to me, I think part of navigating this format is identifying which expensive cards are worth it and which ones aren't. And one of the reasons I like the Kicker cards so much is that I think that they're some of the best expensive cards in the set because they don't need to be expensive.
True, yes. I think for our listeners who are looking for some sort of tangible takeaway on how to actually draft this format that you might not hear anywhere else is my biggest advice. So it's a two-part advice. Firstly, when you're drafting, try to find your first color. You want to be cutting your first color. You want to be finding that first color. And what this does is that it allows you to be flexible in what your second color is. So sometimes maybe pack 2, you'll open up like a rare that you really want to play that, maybe you're already red and you open a Phylath, for example. Definitely the most important thing that you can do, and honestly a lot of draft formats, is to just try to stick to one color first. Like find that one color. Secondly is try to not only look at which colors are open, but how well the cards work together. So a lot of times maybe you'll have maybe red and white will both be open in your seat, but the cards actually don't work together. So just think about how these cards play out together, and that's going to help you a lot in Zendikar Rising.
It's a really good point. One of the biggest pitfalls I've run into in this format in particular is that I'll see like a lot of good blue commons going around the table. And I'll be like, oh, okay, yeah, blue's open. That sounds good. Like I'll get a couple rabid bites and some kind of rando green commons that seem pretty good. And I'll be like, okay, cool. I'm going to move into like a blue-green kicker deck. And at the end of the draft, I just have a very mediocre pile of cards with no real payoffs and like no good uncommons or rares. And it's not the worst place to be because a lot of those cards are just fairly solid. It's like your deck's not going to be embarrassing. But I kind of feel like I got duped into like just because the card pool could support me picking up a bunch of good blue commons, that doesn't really matter because the cards that I picked didn't end up doing very much. So that's an archetype in particular I've found myself ending up in a lot and kind of afterwards regretting my life's choices because I was doing that level 1 play of, oh, these cards are pretty good. This is the best common in the pack. That like I'm getting fed this color. This feels good. And then just realizing that I wasn't actually building a strong deck while I was doing that.
Yeah, so that is going to be the experience of probably the vast majority of people in this format, because the thing is that every color combination can be played in probably, I would say, like 2 to 5 different ways. So realistically, it's your job to try to identify what exactly your deck is trying to do and trying to not only find, but also be flexible in changing that narrative.
I love it. So let's talk about a few cards that people should pick highly because they fit into a lot of different archetypes. There's some uncommons that come to my mind that I think should be top of the pack, bomb level cards to pick. Roost of Drakes being the first and foremost. This card is just good in almost any blue deck. I would be surprised, hard pressed to find any blue deck that I wouldn't want to run this card in. Thwart the Grave, same in black. I would probably even run that card in a deck with no party members whatsoever, just because it's so good.
Yeah, or just a few party members.
Yeah, exactly. Another card that I have found that you can put into a surprisingly large number of decks in the format is a Relic Amulet. I know this is one of your pet cards here.
Yep.
You can have a green deck which is running Reclaim the Waste, Rabid Bite, that 2-mana sorcery that searches up a creature out of your deck. You can look at your green deck by the end of the draft and realize that just in the color green you had 10 ways to trigger your Relic Amulet. So I think a lot of people think that this is a blue-red build around, and I think it's just a fantastic build around outside of maybe clerics or warriors or like a super creature dense deck.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another example of a card that I think you can usually feel confident picking that up, knowing that it's just going to give you a lot of flexibility.
Yeah.
Can you name some other cards you can think of that are just, you know what, this card is just really solid to pick up and it's going to help me no matter which direction I end up going in?
That is a great question. I don't know if there are. I don't know to me if there are any just one size fits all cards like that in this format for me, but I will say that Seagate Colossus, which is a 7-mana 7/5 at common, it gets one cheaper for every party member you have. That card is actually a lot more playable than people give it credit for. It is a card that should be making the vast majority of party decks, at least the first copy of it. So I think that this is one that's quite flexible that you can speculate on early if it's a relatively weak pack. And it's actually a very, very strong role player in any of these party board-centric decks.
So let's just synthesize a few of the things we've talked about here. Number one, red is a very strong color, and my personal opinion, still really underdrafted. I see a lot of these red DFCs going really late, like Kazul's Fury. That card is very good. It's very, very good. Songmad Treachery, also a very, very good card. You just shouldn't be passing these cards as much as you maybe are. Next thing is efficiency is hyper important in this format. Consider taking cheaper, more flexible cards instead of bigger, more expensive cards. And understand that a lot of the best expensive cards are actually the ones that can be cheaper in some way. So, like Thwart the Grave is a great example. Seagate Colossus, great example. Rule number 3 from Deathsie, think really carefully about your removal and think really carefully about how much mana you want to spend on it, and think really carefully about, you know, how much you need to prioritize it in terms of making your deck good. Rule number 4, pick a really strong color, try to get like one color really dialed in, and try to stay open as to how you can supplement that color. I think a lot of people in draft think I'm drafting a 2-color deck, but when you get to the end of the draft, you realize I drafted a white deck with like a heavy black splash.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can you just talk to us about that for just a moment? I feel like this is another thing I've learned from you specifically, is that you'll often be like, yeah, this is a white deck with 8 red cards in it.
Uh-huh.
Is that something that you find yourself doing a lot?
Yeah, so part of the sort of risk mitigation and risk assessing is trying to figure out how to not put too much of a strain on your mana base. Constructed players will kind of understand this a little bit better, probably, like when you're building your mana and just understanding when you can have certain mana, and the cost of having like shock lands and dual lands in your 2 or 3 color deck. Now, in limited, a lot of times people will not understand why when you're running 6 planes in your deck, you don't really want to run a white 1-drop.
Right. Or Nahiri's Binding.
Yeah, exactly. Or Nahiri's Binding, that's like double white. So you just really want to give your deck the best chances of winning, and a lot of times it's about how smooth you can make your deck. And that's going to be trying to mitigate the bad draws, trying to mitigate the awkwardness of the colors in your deck. So you always have to take into account, when can I cast this card, how many sources should I run, and essentially how the deck plays out in the end.
And then again, you know, just wanted to harken back to what Deathsie was saying about this format in particular, but in drafting in general, you just really have to get yourself out of the mindset of this card is good, that card is bad, and more towards what is feeding my plan, what's making the cards I've already picked better, which is the reason that you might find yourself picking Negate instead of Nahiri's Binding, when one just seems like objectively a much stronger card in Limited than the other. So that's something I'm really taking away from our conversation here. Another one I forgot that we mentioned was think about how your deck plays on the draw, and consider heavily whether you can afford to build a deck that has multiple cards in it that don't play very well on the draw or from behind. So consider that. Is there anything else that you want to tell our listeners before we head out here, Deathsie?
Yep. If you want to get better at Constructed, watch Covertgoblue. If you want to get better at limited, watch Deathsie. As simple as that.
There you go. We got all the bases covered. So to that note, Deathsie, people can find you on twitch.tv/Deathsie. Are there any other places, resources, things that you offer that people can go and plug into?
While he prepares for that, I'm going to do something for him. So your tier list for limited is almost a beloved resource for your community. And I think you put a lot of work into it. You can tell that there's experience and experimentation behind it instead of, I read the card, I gave it a grade. And I used it. I know from being on the inside that it was a major draw for Tempo Storm when they were interested in you, when they became interested in you. And it was an inspiration for what I tried to do with my crafting guides for new sets for standard. So that was a big deal for me, because I think it is a step above a lot of what I see in terms of content. So I think it's underappreciated. And if people don't know you, I would suggest the first thing that they do once they go to your Twitch page or your Twitter is check your tier list, because I think it's a step above the typical limited content. And I wanted to make sure that got out there.
Yo, thank you so much, CGB. So, yeah. So for those of you who don't know, Covertgoblue has been killing it on Twitch. Absolutely killing it. Like, I'm the small guy, you know what I mean? So I really do look up to you. So my tier list, a lot of blood and sweat goes into that. Throughout a format, there will probably be like 6 or 7 big iterations of the change. And by the end of the format, it is almost a perfected science to where I like my cards and how I evaluate my cards. So if you check out Deathsie.com, you will find out all of my tier lists there. And it's all of the formats that have ever been in Magic Arena. So you can go all the way back to like Ixalan even. So that's a free resource to offer as well on twitch.tv/Deathsie. That's DEATHSIE. My VODs are available for free. So you can go and check out the drafts and stuff. That is going to be my biggest recommendation for anyone who wants to get a jump start at leveling up your draft game.
And I think that's a really good thing to highlight right now, especially a tier list and whatnot, because we're getting to that point in the season where we're going to start rotating through a bunch of old sets in quick draft.
Yep.
So go check them out. That really is. That's where I would start. You know, if I was like, oh, I've never played this Eldraine format before. Spoiler alert, if you haven't played Eldraine, get used to more milling, because that's going to be happening a certain portion of the time. But anyway, yeah, definitely go check out those tier lists. Couldn't agree more with CGB there. One of the things I like about watching your stream, Deathsie, is the talk, right? Like you were saying that talking about the game is one of the things that you like doing the best. And that's really what I get from your stream, is hearing your opinions on things more than like anything else, is just seeing you be like, no, I'm not going to pick this card here because, you know, X, Y, and Z reason. Mm-hmm. And also I appreciate on your stream how people will ask you really boring questions and you'll just be like, nah, like I'm not even going there. You know, like they'll be like, Deathsie, why didn't you pick so-and-so card? And you're like, no, you tell me why I was supposed to pick that card, and then we can have an interesting conversation about it. I really like that. It's just like that commitment to excellence. I want to engage in dialogue that makes both of us better at Magic.
I mean, we have that as well as just me ranting about like random off-topic Magic stuff. Like the way I generally look at it is that I'm a high-level Magic stream in the background, but in the foreground, I'm just a chatting streamer.
And you can also see Deathsie on a bunch of other cool streams as well. He's moonlighting on a bunch of other streams from friends of his in Korea, for example. So if you want more and more and more Deathsie, then definitely, you know, check out his streams to learn where else he's going to be.
Oh, man, yeah. Next week, I've been invited to do a K-pop training camp. So that's going to be streamed. And I am scared out of my mind. But the teachers are are some of my friends here, and they're like ex K-pop idols and stuff. So
It sounds amazing. You get to be the student instead of the teacher.
yep, exactly.
All right, well, that's going to wrap it up for this week's ArenaCraft podcast. Thank you for listening. I hope you got a lot out of this. I certainly did. You can find ArenaCraft on most places. We're on Spotify, we're on YouTube, we're on iTunes, Stitcher, most podcast platforms. If you can't find us on one, let us know, because we want to be everywhere. You can find Covertgoblue on his, like Deathsie was saying, very, very successful blowing up Twitch stream, Covertgoblue twitch.tv/Covertgoblue.
Soon it will be Covertgoblue /
Twitch.tv.
Taking over.
And of course, he does that Monday through Thursday, 4 p.m. Eastern.
Ooh, I'd like to announce something quickly on your outro. This Thursday, my channel on Twitch, CGB versus the one, the only, Mistman.
Oh,
Whoa.
damn.
The showdown.
The showdown.
Well done. The elusive Mistman. I love it.
Indeed. I couldn't be happier.
Notable control mage as well. I hope you guys will have some fun stuff lined up
The
there.
ultimate war of the Gandalfs.
Indeed. You can also find Covertgoblue's content on YouTube. He's absolutely killing it there as well. All right. Thank you so much, both of you gentlemen. I wish you the best of luck in the arena in this coming week.
Goodbye.